This is not just a story, it's a scream that took decades to find a voice. Her name is Elizabeth. At 68, she had everything that money could buy: a mansion, luxury clothes, dinners with powerful people, but none of that could warm the cold floor she was forced to sleep on, while her millionaire husband owned 12 thriving companies. Behind closed doors and heavy curtains, Elizabeth wasn't living, she was surviving. Her embroidery needles, once a symbol of her passion, were stripped from her hands like weapons. Her dreams, labeled as whims and discarded like trash. Yet from that pain, she began stitching something much stronger: courage. Set in the shadows of wealth and silence, this story reveals how an invisible woman rose, not with noise, but with quiet determination, one stitch at a time. So get comfortable. Let this story move you. It will hold you from the first second to the last. And if you feel something, anything, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Because this isn't just Elizabeth's story, it's one that belongs to many. We're here to listen, and this memory deserves to be heard.
Hello, thank you so much for listening. I'd like to share a story that has stayed with me, one that for years I kept locked away. Come a little closer. Do you mind if I hold your hand while I talk? At 68 years old, these hands have stitched together enough stories to cover every wall in Savannah. You know, some nights I still feel the chill of that hardwood floor where I slept for so many years, with the scent of expensive roses hanging in the air of that mansion that never truly felt like home. They say dignity is priceless, but I learned its cost, exactly what it took to abandon everything I thought was my life. For 35 years, I slept next to a man who went from prince to executioner, from partner to judge. Wipe away those tears, honey, because this story doesn't start sad. It starts with a woman on the floor who one day finally decided to stand up. So here we go. When I look back on my 68 years, I see a little girl with long braids running down the brick streets of Savannah. That girl was me. Emily Parker, daughter of Mr. Richard, a fabric merchant who barely earned enough to support his 5 children. My mother, Mrs. Carroll, was a quiet woman who expressed her love through her hands: cooking, sewing, quilting. I inherited not only her features, but also a passion for needles and thread. Our house was small but welcoming. The faded yellow walls and worn linoleum floor contrasted with the colorful quilts that my mother hung everywhere. "Emily," she would say as she taught me to quilt, "a woman should have something of her own, even if it's just the knowledge in her hands." My father was a man of few words and many rules. The women of the house were to follow a set path: learn household chores, find a good husband, and be obedient wives. My brothers, on the other hand, enjoyed freedoms that were forbidden to me. They could study, go out with friends, dream of careers. I could only aspire to a good marriage. "Emily, sit up straight. Ladies, don't slouch. Emily, lower your voice. No one wants a loud wife. Emily, don't contradict your father. What will your future husband think?" These phrases marked my adolescence like small, invisible scars. At 16, my world was limited to school, church, and family gatherings. My friends were starting to date, but I stayed home, helping my mother or quilting blankets that we then sold to supplement the family income. My only true companion was Lucy Rodriguez, a neighbor with a wide smile and a rebellious spirit who dreamed of being a teacher. "One day we'll get out of here," she would tell me as we walked home from school. "You with your quilts, and me with my books." I would smile without really believing it. Women like us rarely escape their predetermined destiny. I first felt the weight of my condition when my father fell ill. At 17, I had to drop out of school to help at home while my brothers continued their studies. "It's only natural," my mother said with resignation. "Women are the backbone of the family in hard times." During this time, my quilts became more elaborate, more personal. Each stitch was an unspoken word, each color a suppressed emotion. With my hands, I created the world I couldn't have, and in secret, I sold some pieces at the local market with Lucy's help. It was during one of those visits to the market when I met him. Ethan Bennett, a 22-year-old son of a prosperous businessman with ambitions that exceeded the limits of our small town. He was handsome, with a smile that seemed to light up the whole square, and a way of speaking that made any idea sound possible. "Did you make this?" he asked as he held up one of my quilted scarves. His eyes, dark and deep, seemed to see something in me that I didn't even know myself. I nodded, feeling for the first time proud of my creations. "You have magical hands, Emily," he said with a smile that took my breath away. "You should be showing your work in better places than this market." That meeting changed the course of my life. Ethan began to visit me at home, winning over my family first, and then me. He was polite, respectful, and spoke of a bright future where my quilts could be appreciated appreciated as true works of art. Imagine, Emily, he would say as we strolled under the watchful eye of my mother, a store downtown with your creations in the window. We could call it Emily's Quilts. My father, weakened by illness but still firm in his convictions, saw in Ethan the solution to his worries, a good match for his daughter, and the promise of a stable future. He's a hard-working man with vision, he said. You won't find a better husband in all of Savannah. My mom, always the cautious one, watched in silence. One evening, as we were knitting together under the soft glow of a table lamp, she said something to me that I wouldn't fully understand. For years, love is like a knitted sweater, honey. On the outside, it might look perfect, but it's the knots and loops you can't see that hold everything together. Pay close attention to those knots before you give away your heart. But I was too captivated by the dreams that Michael painted for us. At 19, with a heart full of hope and a head full of illusions, I agreed to become his wife. On our wedding day, under the soaring ceiling of St. Patrick's Cathedral, I vowed eternal love to a man I thought I knew, ignoring the subtle signs that my gut was trying to show me. Those first few years of marriage were like a blank canvas that we slowly filled with colors, some bright, others darker. Michael worked tirelessly on his business ventures, while I kept alive the hope for that little yarn store he had promised me. The afternoons in our new house had a particular rhythm. I would knit by the window while Michael reviewed his documents. At the mahogany desk he was so proud of. It's important to project an image of success, he explained whenever I questioned the price of the furniture. His first company, a distributor of craft supplies, was beginning to grow, and with it, his ambitions. We need to network with important people, he insisted every time he organized dinners for potential partners. On these occasions, my role was clear: smile, serve, and stay quiet. My opinions, which had seemed to interest him at the beginning of our marriage, gradually lost value in his ears. The years passed, and the yarn store remained a hazy promise. When the company is more stable, when we open the second branch, when we have more capital, there was always a when that postponed my dreams. One spring morning, 5 years after our wedding, I received the news of my father's passing. The pain pierced me like a needle through fine fabric, leaving a void impossible to fill. Michael, busy with the opening of his second company, barely accompanied me to the funeral. Business doesn't wait, Sarah. Your dad would understand. The following Sunday, while Edward was out golfing with his buddies, I asked Rose to come with me to the farmer's market. My heart was pounding as I carried a few of my pieces wrapped in newspaper. The smell of spices, the chatter of vendors, the vibrant colors, it all reminded me of when I was a kid and tagged along with my mom to the flea market. Among the stalls, I found Mrs. Gertrude, a woman around 70 with gnarled hands and a warm smile. She examined my needlepoint with experienced eyes, nodding in approval. Honey, you've got talent. Why don't you join us? We share the booth and split the profits. I came home with my own money for the first time in decades. It was just a few bucks, but it represented something much more valuable: the possibility of independence. I hid the money in my secret stash, along with the scrap of paper where Mrs. Gertrude had written down the time for next Sunday. For weeks, I kept up this little rebellion. Every Sunday, I made up excuses to leave: church visits, volunteering, specific errands. Edward, preoccupied with his booming business, barely noticed my Sunday absences. My needlepoint started selling regularly. Small hand towels, decorative scarves, pillowcases. Each piece carried a piece of my soul. The customers asked for the new stitcher and came back looking for more of my work. In that corner of the market, surrounded by women who valued my art, I found a space where I could be Isabel again, not just Mrs. Henderson's shadow. One Sunday morning, Mrs. Gertrude introduced me to Lucy Sanders, my childhood friend, now turned retired teacher. We hugged with tears in our eyes, reconnecting decades of separation in seconds. She coordinated a small craft workshop for senior women at the community center. Come with us, Isabel, she invited me. There's a place for you and your embroidered stories. The happiness I felt with my new friends and my small independence was short-lived. Rose was waiting for me anxiously when I returned from the market that Sunday afternoon. Her pale face warned me that something serious had happened. Mr. Henderson came home early from the club, Mrs. Henderson. He asked for you several times. Her trembling hands nervously adjusted her apron. I think he found your needlepoint. I heard noises in your room. My heart stopped as I hurried. Upstairs, the door to our room was open. Edward, his face hardened with anger, held my needlepoint box. My pieces, my precious works, my treasures were scattered on the floor like old rags. You've been deceiving me this whole time? His voice sounded controlled, but his eyes burned. Selling yourself like some common vendor wonder while I was building an empire for us? I didn't deceive you, Edward. I'm just doing needlepoint, like I always have. I tried to stay calm, although my voice betrayed my fear. And this, he waved a small wallet where I kept my earnings. Stealing from me to finance your whims. It's my money. I earned it with my work. For the first time in years, I dared to meet his gaze. His laughter was like a whip. Your money. Nothing in this house is yours, Isabel. Everything you have is thanks to me. That night, Edward took drastic measures. He called all the staff and forbade them from helping me leave the house without his explicit permission. He fired Rose on the spot, accusing her of complicity. As the young woman gathered her belongings through tears, she looked at me with a mixture of compassion and fear that broke my heart. "I've been too lenient with you," declared Edward when we were alone. "Clearly you need to remember your place." He took my embroidery scissors, my needles, and all my threads, throwing them in the trash before my eyes. Then, in a final act of cruelty, he tore my most precious pieces, those that told stories that only I understood. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be sleeping in the guest room. You don't deserve to share my bed." But the guest room was just the beginning. 3 days later, when I tried to go out to the garden, I discovered that the doors were locked. Edward had ordered the staff to watch my movements. My cell phone mysteriously disappeared, and the landline only worked under supervision. The humiliation reached its peak during a dinner with important business partners. Edward introduced me as always, but added a comment that chilled my blood. "My wife has been a little disoriented lately, suffering from episodes of confusion. The doctor says it's normal at her age." His charming smile concealed the venom of his words. "That's why we limit her outings, for her own safety." The guests nodded sympathetically, casting pitying glances my way. It was then I understood his strategy. He was crafting a narrative where I was a confused old woman who needed to be controlled. Fear paralyzed me as I realized how easily he could completely confine me, perhaps even in some institution, if he decided to push this lie further. That night, for the first time, he didn't allow me to sleep in a bed. "People as confused as you are sleep better on the floor," he declared coldly. "Maybe that will remind you who's in charge around here." 3 weeks passed, sleeping on the hard floor of the living room. My body, already worn by the years, protested with aches each morning. But my spirit began to harden instead of break. While Robert believed he was breaking me, he was actually forging a silent determination within me. I observed every movement in the house with a new attentiveness, the routines of the staff, Robert's schedules, the moments when the surveillance relaxed. I learned that the gardener always left the back door ajar when watering the plants in the yard. I noticed that Martha, the oldest cook, looked at me with compassion and sometimes left small pieces of paper and pencils near me, feigning distraction. One Tuesday, while cleaning Robert's office under the supervision of another employee, the phone rang. My guard left to notify my husband, and I seized those seconds to quickly grab the phone and dial the only number I clearly remembered, the community center where Susan volunteered. "Hillside Community Center," a young voice answered. "Please, message for Susan Miller," I whispered urgently. "Eleanor Davis needs help. I'm trapped at home." "Thompson, Ridgewood Estates." I hung up just as I heard footsteps approaching. My heart beat so loudly I feared the employee could hear it, but my face remained impassive as I continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. 2 days later, while Robert attended an important meeting, a van arrived with the Hillside Florals logo. A young woman stepped out carrying a spectacular floral arrangement. "Delivery for Mr. Thompson," she announced with professional confidence. "Special thanks. For valued customers." The staff, accustomed to Robert receiving gifts from companies, let her into the foyer. The young woman, upon seeing me, winked discreetly while placing the flowers on a table. As she left, she dropped a small note that I discreetly picked up. "Sunday, 8 a.m. Gardener on board. Small bag. Susan." For 3 days, I lived with my heart in my throat, fearing Robert would discover the plan. I was extremely submissive, trying not to arouse suspicion. "The punishment is doing you good," he commented with satisfaction, seeing me so docile. On Saturday night, while everyone slept, I prepared a small bag with the essentials, personal documents I had managed to retrieve, the few pieces of jewelry that were truly mine, a change of clothes, and the picture of my mother I always kept hidden. I hid it in the garden, among the rose bushes. At dawn on Sunday, I pretended to be asleep when Robert got up for his golf game. "I'll be back for lunch," he warned me. "I don't want any trouble." As soon as his car left the property, I saw the gardener enter with his usual equipment. He approached me naturally, pretending to check the nearby plants. "In 5 minutes, ma'am," he murmured. "The back door. A car is waiting on the corner." My entire body trembled as I retrieved my bag and headed for the back back door. Every creak of the floor sounded like thunder in my ears. Every shadow seemed like an obstacle. When I finally crossed the threshold and breathed the fresh air, I felt like I was emerging from a tomb. A simple car waited with the engine running. Inside, Susan greeted me with a hug that broke 40 years of loneliness. "Quick, Eleanor," she urged as the driver pulled away. "We're going to a safe place." I looked back one last time. The mansion that had been my prison diminished in the distance. At 68 years old, I was running away like a rebellious teenager with nothing more than a small bag and a heart that, surprisingly, beat full of hope. The women's shelter was on the outskirts of town, a simple but welcoming house where they received me without asking questions. Karen, the director, a woman in her 50s with eyes that had seen too much pain, assigned me a room I shared with Dorothy, a 70-year-old widow who had escaped an abusive son. Older women are the invisible victims, Karen explained during my first week there. Society prefers to think domestic violence ends with youth. The first few days I spent constantly peering out the window, terrified of seeing Richard's car pull up at any moment. I jumped at every loud noise and slept only a few hours each night. My body, free from its physical prison, remained trapped by fear. "It's normal," Carol assured me, visiting daily. "Your mind needs time to understand you're safe." The news of my disappearance appeared in the local paper a week later. The article described an elderly woman with memory issues who wandered away from her assisted living facility. The photo Richard provided showed me looking confused, a snapshot taken after one of our worst arguments. "He's building his alibi," explained the shelter's lawyer. "He wants everyone to believe you're disoriented, not that you ran away." 2 weeks after my escape, when I finally felt safe enough to venture out, I visited the community center with Carol. There, in a bright room, I found a group of women of all ages working on their craft projects. They welcomed me as if I'd always belonged. "You need to occupy your hands and your mind," Carol insisted, placing fabrics, threads, and needles in front of me. My fingers, trembling at first, soon remembered the rhythm of embroidery. I started with simple figures, flowers, birds, geometric patterns. Each stitch returned a small piece of my identity. Gradually, my designs became more complex, weaving colors and textures that told stories without words. The center's director, impressed by my work, offered me the chance to lead the beginner's embroidery workshop. "You have something to teach, Mary. Not just technique, but resilience." Afraid but determined, I accepted. My first class was a disaster. My voice almost inaudible, my hands shaking as I demonstrated the basic stitches. But my students, mostly older women like myself, looked at me with patience and respect. "I'll do better next week," I promised, more to myself than to them. And I did. Each class made me more confident, my voice stronger. I discovered I had valuable knowledge to share, stories to tell through the art of embroidery. The women who attended my workshop started bringing their friends and family. Money was tight. I lived on the small earnings from my classes and the occasional sale of my pieces at craft fairs. I shared a tiny apartment with Barbara in a modest but safe neighborhood. Our lives, austere in material terms, blossomed in other ways. One day, while teaching the granddaughter of one of my students, the shelter's lawyer visited with troubling news. "Richard has hired private investigators," she informed me with concern. "He's using all his connections to find you. It's not out of love, Mary. He discovered that without your signature, he can't sell some properties that are in both your names." Fear returned, but this time it didn't paralyze me. For the first time in my life, I had something to defend beyond my survival, my newfound freedom, and the community that had welcomed me as one of their own. The threat from Richard sparked a mobilization among the women at the community center. Susan organized a surveillance system, taking turns accompanying me everywhere. Carol contacted a lawyer specializing in domestic violence cases who agreed to represent me pro bono. "You have rights, Mary," insisted Mr. Johnson as he examined my marriage documents. "Half of that estate legally belongs to you, even if he wants to deny it." For 3 months, I lived under constant tension, but I refused to stop living my life. My embroidery workshops had become spaces of healing not only for me, but for many women who found in textile art a way to process their own traumas. One spring Tuesday, while preparing materials for my class, the community center door opened. Richard entered with the arrogance of someone who knows he's powerful, flanked by 2 men in suits whom I presumed to be his lawyers. "Finally found you," he said in a controlled but furious voice. "It's time to come home, Mary. This game has gone on long enough." I felt short of breath. My hands instinctively reached for the back of a chair for support. But then something extraordinary happened. Barbara, Susan, Carol, and all the women women present formed a circle around me, like a human barrier between Richard and me. Mrs. Davis isn't going anywhere against her will, Susan declared firmly. Richard laughed incredulously. This is ridiculous. She's my wife, she's confused, and she needs medical attention. I'm perfectly lucid, I replied, surprising myself with the clarity in my voice. And I'm not property, Edward. I'm a person who's made a decision. For a moment, I saw bewilderment in his eyes. For decades, he had controlled every aspect of my existence, and now he was facing a version of me he didn't recognize. If you insist on this behavior, I will be forced to take legal action, he threatened. Regaining his composure, I have connections these women can't even imagine. We have lawyers too, interrupted Sarah, and documented evidence of the abuse Elizabeth suffered for years. At that moment, as if orchestrated, Dr. Miller entered, along with an officer from the Women's Advocacy Group. The presence of these authority figures seemed to destabilize Edward momentarily. The meeting that followed was tense but crucial. For 3 hours in a small conference room, terms and conditions were discussed. Edward, aware that a public scandal could affect his business, finally agreed to negotiate. The agreement we reached wasn't perfect, but it was liberating. Divorce, with an equitable division of assets, monthly alimony, and most importantly, the guarantee that he wouldn't approach me or the community center under any circumstances. You can have your freedom, Elizabeth, he sneered as he signed the preliminary documents. In the end, you were always too insignificant to me. His words, which in another time would have destroyed me, now bounced off my strengthened skin. Thank you, Edward, I replied sincerely. You gave me the best gift possible. A year later, at 70 years old, I opened my first solo exhibition in a small gallery downtown. Threads of Freedom showcased a series of quilts that narrated my life, from oppression to liberation. The most prominent was a tapestry where I had recreated Edward's mansion, but with the doors and windows wide open as a flock of multicolored birds escaped into a bright sky. Each stitch was part of my healing, I explained to those present during the opening. Quilting isn't just about creating beauty, it's also about mending the soul. Among the audience, I recognized Jenny, the young housekeeper Edward had fired for helping me. Now she was one of my most dedicated students and had become almost like a daughter to me. You know what you taught me, Mrs. Elizabeth? She said to me that night as we celebrated the success of the exhibition, that it's never too late to stitch a new life. Her words perfectly summarized my story. At an age when many believe that all that remains is to contemplate the past, I had found a new dawn, weaving with colorful threads a future that now belonged entirely to me. It was during those days of mourning that something changed definitively between us. My mother, now a widow, gave me a box with the needles and yarn that had belonged to my grandmother. Your father wanted you to have them, she said with suppressed tears. He always believed in your talent, even if he never expressed it. That revelation gave me the courage to talk to Michael about the store. I waited for the right moment. When we were dining alone in the dining room of our increasingly luxurious house, I want to use my father's inheritance to open my yarn store, I said with a firmness that surprised me. His reaction chilled me to the bone. The charming smile that had won me over turned into an expression of contempt. Are you still on about that ridiculous idea? Don't be absurd, Sarah. That inheritance is insignificant, but it will be useful for the expansion of the business. But it's my inheritance, Michael. My father, he didn't let me finish. His fist slammed on the table with such force that the crystal glasses trembled. Your inheritance? Everything we have is thanks to my work. Do you think these furnishings, this house, the clothes you wear came from your little knitting projects? His words crushed me like a heavy slab. It wasn't just what he said, but the contempt with which he pronounced each syllable. That night I discovered that the man I had idealized no longer existed, if he ever had. In the following days, Michael took control of the inheritance with a frightening ease. Contracts that I signed without understanding, meetings with lawyers where my presence was merely decorative. My mother, worried about my downcast appearance, asked me if everything was okay. It's just marital adjustments, I lied, unable to confess that my husband, the one who promised to support my dreams, had just buried them under the weight of his ambition. 10 years after our wedding, Michael already owned 5 thriving companies. Our house in the suburbs had been replaced by a mansion in the upscale part of town. Imported furniture, household staff, constant social events. We lived like the local elite. But in my heart, there was only a growing emptiness. My stitches became mechanical in those years. I knitted without soul as I watched my life turn into a gilded cage. Michael had had multiplied his companies, and with each new acquisition, his treatment of me hardened even more. It was no longer just indifference, but a meticulous control over every aspect of my existence. Carol, that outfit isn't appropriate for a businessman's wife. Carol, don't offer opinions on subjects you don't understand. Carol, smile more when you greet my partners. His orders, disguised as advice, whittled me down until I was a mere shadow of myself. The parties at our mansion in Greenwich were frequent, but I felt invisible amidst so many influential people. My role was limited to being the perfect hostess, the impeccable wife of the successful Robert Thompson. While pouring glasses of champagne and smiling politely, my eyes searched for an exit I couldn't find. One autumn afternoon, I dared to sign up for a quilting workshop up at the community center. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of the passion I had left dormant among colorful fabrics and the sincere laughter of other women. I remembered who I was before my identity was buried under my husband's expectations. "Where have you been all afternoon?" Robert interrogated me when I got home, his voice laced with suspicion. I told him about the workshop, trying to infect him with my enthusiasm. His response was devastating. "Wasting time with nonsense? I have an important dinner with investors tomorrow, and I need you to oversee the catering." I tried to explain how important that creative space was to me, but his eyes hardened. "Enough with the whims, Carol. At your age, you should behave with more dignity, not playing with quilting like a bored old woman." That night, I cried silently in the bathroom, where the sound of the shower masked my sobs. The next morning, I pretended nothing had happened and dedicated myself to organizing the perfect dinner for his partners. During the event, one of the guests, an older man with kind eyes, noticed my framed quilts on the wall. "Extraordinary work, Mrs. Thompson. Are these yours?" he asked with genuine interest. Before I could answer, Robert interjected. "They're from a local artisan. My wife collects them. Carol has good taste in decor, although little talent for handicrafts." The polite chuckles that followed his comment were like small stabs in my heart. That night, when everyone had left, Robert looked at me coldly. "Don't go back to that workshop. I don't want my wife to be seen as some simple craftswoman." The control intensified. Robert began to review my expenses, questioning every penny I couldn't justify. The driver who used to take me wherever I wanted now reported directly to him. My phone calls were brief and almost always supervised by his close presence. My world narrowed until it was limited to the walls of that mansion, where every room reminded me of my cage. In my silent despair, I started quilting small pieces that I hid among my clothes. Each stitch was a muted cry, each color a feeling I couldn't express aloud. I quilted stories of freedom while living one of oppression, dreaming of an escape that seemed impossible at my 65 years. I quilted in secret for 3 years, accumulating small pieces that I hid in an empty shoebox at the back of the closet. Every time Robert went on a business trip, I would take out my treasures and spread them on the bed, admiring those fragments of freedom that I had managed to create between the cracks of my gilded prison. The storm that changed my life arrived. On a May morning, Robert was reviewing his email when he found the credit card statement. His eyes narrowed as he examined each line. "You bought quilting materials at the craft store downtown? With whose permission, Carol?" His voice was calm, which made it more terrifying. I froze, with the coffee cup trembling in my hands. "I needed something to occupy my time when you're away," I replied in a threat of a voice. Robert stood up slowly, walking towards me like a predator. "I gave you everything, Carol. A house that many would envy. Designer clothes, jewelry. And this is how you thank me? Disobeying my orders." That afternoon, while Robert was at the office, Maria, the youngest maid in the house, found me crying in the garden. At just 23, she had the wisdom of someone who had seen a lot of suffering. "Mrs. Thompson, my grandmother sells her crafts at the farmer's market on Sundays. Maybe you could..." She stopped, fearful of having crossed a line, but her words planted a seed in my mind. I asked for more details, and she told me about a group of women who sold their creations in a corner of the downtown market.